Commercial flying isn't mysterious. People who don't do it for a living tend to think it is. They imagine turbulence as danger, clouds as concealment, altitude as risk. From the cockpit, it's the opposite. Everything's measured and mapped. Every airway, altitude, every transition point exists because someone long before you figured out the safest, most efficient way to move aluminum through the air. By the time you reach an airline cockpit, the romance is gone. You trust procedures because they work. You trust instruments because they don't care how you feel. You trust airspace because it's regulated down to the mile and the minute. The sky, as far as we're concerned, is owned. Most flights blend together after a while. Push back, taxi, line up, climb, cruise, descend, land. Weather is either something you work around or something you delay for. Traffic is background noise. Emergencies are rare, and when they do happen, they follow predictable patterns. That's why training exists. That's why checklists exist. You're taught early on not to personalize anomalies. Systems fail sometimes. Humans make mistakes. You correct, continue, and you log it in if you need to. Aviation is built on the idea that nothing should ever surprise you. And for most of my career, that was true. I have flown in every condition that makes passengers grip armrest and swear off flying forever. Severe turbulence, lightning crawling across the windshield, winds strong enough that landing felt like setting the airplane down sideways. And none of that stuck with me. None of that even made me question the job. What stuck were the flights where nothing went wrong. Clear weather, normal traffic, nominal systems. Those are the ones that bother me now. There's a confidence that comes with airline flying that's hard to explain unless you've been there. You're not wondering what's around you. Between GPS, inertial systems, radar, traffic displays, and constant communication with air traffic control, there shouldn't be anything you don't know about in the sky around you. The phrase we use is situational awareness, and modern cockpits are designed to make it nearly impossible to lose. You know where you are, who's above you, who's below you, who's crossing 10 miles ahead, and who will be there in 5 minutes. The margins are tight, but they're intentional. That's why when something doesn't line up, it's unsettling in a way turbulence never is. Turbulence is chaotic, but it follows rules. Wind shear, thermal activity, mountain waves, you can point to causes. You can explain it and brief it. You can predict it. What I'm talking about are moments when the sky behaves like it skipped a step. I didn't notice it at first. Most pilots wouldn't. The first few times it was easy to write off as clerical noise. A bad timestamp, a delayed data entry, somebody on the ground clicking the wrong field in a system that feeds a dozen others. Aviation runs on layers of software stitched together over decades, and small errors happen. But small errors don't repeat cleanly. They don't show up across independent systems that aren't supposed to talk to each other. They don't persist after you double check them. And they definitely don't leave you with the feeling that something arrived before it should have. There's an unspoken rule in this job. You don't chase ghosts. If you start treating every irregularity as something ominous, you'll burn out fast. You stick to what you can verify. You fly the airplane. You let maintenance worry about hardware, and dispatch worry about paperwork. Still, there are things pilots talk about quietly, usually off the record. Things that don't fit into reports cleanly. Routes that feel short on certain days. Calls that don't quite sound right until later. Visuals that vanish the moment you look away. Nobody frames these as stories. They're anecdotes, delivered flatly, usually followed by a shrug. Aviation attracts practical people. We don't lean into mystery. And that's why it took me years to accept that what I was seeing wasn't random. It wasn't weather or fatigue. and it wasn't coincidence. The sky behaves the way it does because we expect it to. Because we assume distance is fixed, time is linear, and airspace is consistent. Almost all of the time, those assumptions hold. Almost. The flights I'm about to describe didn't involve emergencies. No maydays or screaming alarms or heroic landings. They were ordinary flights that ended with data that didn't belong to them. And once you notice that kind of thing, it becomes harder to ignore the days when the sky feels just a little too efficient, a little too close. Alright, well, let's get to incident 1. The suitcase that arrived first. This one didn't feel important at the time. If anything, it felt like a mild inconvenience wrapped in somebody else's problem. We were already taxiing in when the cabin crew called up to the cockpit to let us know a passenger had a question about their bag. That happens on almost every flight. People worry their luggage didn't make it. They misread the carousel numbers. They assume the worst before the aircraft doors even open. We told the lead flight attendant to have the passenger check with baggage services at the terminal. Standard response. We shut down, ran our checklist, and opened the door. Nothing unusual. The flight itself had been unremarkable. Short hop with clear weather and light load. Smooth ride the whole way down. We'd been a few minutes early on arrival, which always feels like a small victory, even though it doesn't actually change anything. I was finishing up paperwork when the same flight attendant came back up front. She said the passenger was insisting that their bag was already waiting for them. I remember half smiling and saying something like, "That'd be a first," without really thinking about it. She didn't laugh. She said the passenger had a photo. That got my attention. I followed her off the aircraft and down into the jet bridge where the passenger was standing with their phone out. Middle-aged guy. Calm, not angry or excited, just confused. He showed me a photo of his suitcase sitting by itself near the carousel. It was unmistakably his. Distinctive color, scuffed corner, a ribbon tied to the handle. The timestamp on the photo showed it'd been taken 10 minutes earlier. At that point, I assumed it was a reused bag photo from a previous trip. People do that sometimes. They try to prove a point by recycling evidence. I don't know, it's strange. And then he showed me the baggage claim notification. His bag had been scanned into the destination system before we landed. That's the part that still sticks with me. Airplane baggage handling is messy, but it's not magical. A bag doesn't exist in the arrival system until it's physically offloaded, scanned, and inducted onto a belt. Every step is logged automatically. It's not dependent on one person remembering to click a button. I told him to head to baggage services and said I'd check with ground operations. Again, nothing dramatic, just due diligence. By the time I got back to the cockpit, the first officer had already heard about it from the ramp crew, and they were just as confused. We pulled up the timeline. Departure scan, correct. Bag loaded on our aircraft at the origin. Weight and balance reflected it. Cargo door sealed. Arrival scan, timestamped 7 minutes before touchdown. I checked the flight log to make sure it wasn't misreading something. The aircraft's on-block time was recorded properly. The arrival scan predated it cleanly. Not by seconds, by minutes. Ground ops assumed it was a system sync issue. That's the phrase they used. A delay between systems updating or a cached entry being released early. Sounded reasonable enough. These systems are old, layered and patched, sometimes temperamental. Still, it bothered me. I asked if any other bags from our flight had similar timestamps. They didn't. Just the one. Maintenance checked the cargo door seals as a formality, and everything was normal. Dispatch reviewed the load sheet. Normal. The bag tag number matched the passenger. No duplication or misroute. Eventually, The explanation settled on data irregularity, which is airline shorthand for "we don't know." The passenger got his bag, and it was intact, no damage or missing things. He thanked us and left. And that should have been the end of it. But later that night, after we'd flown another leg and parked for the evening, the first officer brought it up again. He asked if I'd ever seen anything like that before. I said no. He said neither had he. What made it worse wasn't the anomaly itself. It was how clean it was, No errors or system meltdown, It was like one object behaving as if distance didn't apply to it. Well, a few weeks later, something similar happened on a different route. Different aircraft and crew and airport. Same result. A bag scanned into the arrival system early. This time, the difference was that someone noticed before the aircraft even landed. Ground ops flagged it while we were still on descent. They assumed the bag had been misloaded onto an earlier flight. It hadn't. The tag trace showed it loaded onto our aircraft at the origin. The ramp cameras confirmed it. The bag never left the plane. Yet there it was, logged as having arrived. Again, no other bags showed the same behavior. Again, the explanation was quietly closed as a system error. Well, I started asking around, casually, over coffee during layovers, in the way pilots talk when they're not writing anything down. A cargo captain told me he'd seen a pallet register as delivered while they were still over the ocean. He'd laughed it off at the time. Another pilot mentioned a wheelchair that appeared at the gate before the aircraft reached the stand. He said he assumed it was a coincidence until he realized the gate hadn't been assigned yet. None of these incidents were alarming on their own. Nobody filed safety reports or escalated them. They didn't affect operations. But they shared the same shape. An object arriving before its carrier. At first, I told myself I was looking for patterns that weren't there. That's human nature. Once you notice something odd, you start seeing it everywhere. But I kept quiet records just for myself. And the more I looked, the more strange things got. Incident 2. The missing minutes. Now, the next one didn't involve baggage or ground systems. It involved us. It was a medium-length domestic leg, long enough to settle into cruise, but short enough that you're paying attention to the clock. Those flights live and die on timing. Fuel planning, descent profiles, crew duty limits, everything is built around predictable minutes. Weather was clear from departure to destination. Not mostly clear, but clear. No convective activity. No jet stream anomalies worth mentioning. No altitude changes requested. It was one of those days where flying feels almost automated. We leveled off early and settled into cruise. Engines were stable. Fuel flow was exactly where it should be. Ground speed was normal for the altitude and wind component we had. Nothing unusual. About halfway through the leg, air traffic control asked us to confirm our position. That's not unheard of, but it's a little uncommon. Normally, they already know. Radar, ADS-B, transponder returns, our position is being tracked constantly. I read back our coordinates. There was a pause on the frequency. Then ATC asked us to say it again. I did, and there was another pause. They came back and asked if we could confirm our ground speed. I glanced down, read it off, and looked at the first officer. He shrugged. Everything looked fine. ATC acknowledged and told us to continue as cleared. And that was it. Now, if that had been the end of it, I wouldn't be telling this story. A few minutes later, we were handed off to the next sector much earlier than expected. The first officer noticed it at the same time I did. He tapped the navigation display and asked if I thought the wind data had updated incorrectly. We cross-checked and it hadn't. The forecast and actuals were aligned. I pulled up the flight plan timing. According to the numbers, we were ahead. According to the engines, we weren't. According to the ground speed, we weren't. According to the clock, we were. It didn't add up. Well, the rest of the flight went normally. Descent, approach, landing, all standard. It wasn't until later, after shutdown, that things started to bother me. I pulled the post-flight data out of habit more than concern. Engine trends were clean. Fuel burn was exactly where it should have been. No spikes or anomalies. And then I looked at the recorded timestamps. The flight data recorder showed a gap. The aircraft transitioned between two logged waypoints faster than the distance between them should have allowed. The timestamps were clean, sequential, no errors. It was as if the airplane had covered a stretch of airspace without spending the expected amount of time inside it. I showed it to the first officer. He frowned, recalculated it manually, and came to the same conclusion. We went through every reasonable explanation. There's no tailwind, no altitude deviation, instrument error, cross-checked across independent systems. GPS glitch, well, possible, but unlikely given the consistency across multiple sensors. Eventually, we landed on the same conclusion aviation always does when something doesn't affect safety. Log it and move on. So we did. The next time it happened was 3 months later. Different route and aircraft, similar length. Same result. This time, ATC noticed again. They asked us to slow down. That got my attention. You don't get asked to slow down in cruise unless spacing is off. We reduced speed slightly, well within normal limits. A few minutes later, they asked us to slow again. We complied. According to them, we were closing on traffic ahead much faster than expected. According to our displays, we weren't. There was no visual traffic, nothing on the scope. After landing, I requested a copy of the ATC timing data through normal channels. They took a while. By the time it came back, I'd almost forgotten about it. The timestamps didn't match ours. Their system showed us passing through controlled airspace earlier than our onboard systems indicated. I stopped talking about it openly after that. Not because anybody told me to stop, but because I recognized the look people gave me when I brought it up. Aviation doesn't reward curiosity unless it improves safety or efficiency. Everything else is noise. Still, I started paying closer attention. Some flights felt longer than scheduled. Some felt shorter. Most felt normal. The ones that didn't weren't tied to weather or traffic or aircraft type. There was no consistent pattern I could point to. No particular altitude or latitude that explained it. Just stretches of sky that seemed to let you through faster than they should. I didn't feel anything during those moments. No physical sensation or visual distortion. No sound. If you weren't watching the numbers, you'd never know anything had happened. That's the part that bothers me. If something dangerous is happening, you expect warning signs, you know? Alarms, vibration. This didn't feel dangerous. It felt efficient. Like the sky had decided we didn't need to spend as much time there. After the third occurrence, I stopped assuming it was a coincidence. After the fourth, I stopped telling myself it was fatigue. After the fifth, I started wondering what would happen if we stayed inside one of those compressed stretches longer than usual. So far, we never have. Not deliberately, anyway. And that's probably for the best. Incident 3. This one took time to understand. At the moment it happened, there was nothing about it that felt wrong. It sounded exactly like a pilot doing his job. We were in cruise, mid-morning, clear skies, international airspace, but well within normal commercial corridors. The radios were busy in the way they usually are. Position reports, Altitude confirmations, handoffs between sectors, nothing stood out. And then a call came in on our frequency. It was brief and professional. The voice identified an aircraft by call sign and tail number, stated their position, altitude, and heading, and requested confirmation of traffic in the area. Standard stuff. I glanced at the traffic display. Nothing showed nearby. Before I could respond, ATC came back and acknowledged the call. They issued a routine advisory and cleared the aircraft to continue on course. The exchange was clean, textbook phraseology, nothing improvised. The voice sounded calm. Male, middle-aged, if I had to guess. Slight accent, hard to place but not unusual. Pilots fly internationally all the time. I remember thinking briefly that his radio sounded a little older. Not bad, just flatter, less processed. But that could have been anything. Radio quality varies. We never saw the aircraft. Not visually. Not on TCAS. Not on radar. That, too, isn't unheard of. Sometimes traffic is below radar coverage, or shielded by terrain, or filtered out momentarily. It happens. A few minutes later, the aircraft called again. Same voice and calm tone, same professional cadence. They thanked ATC and reported clear of the area. Then the frequency moved on. The rest of the flight was uneventful. We landed, parked, and went about our day. It wasn't until that evening, during a layover, that the first officer brought it up. He asked if I'd noticed that the call sign sounded unfamiliar. I shrugged. Call signs change. Charter flights, cargo ops, repositioning legs, you hear all kinds of identifiers. He said he'd tried to look it up out of curiosity. It wasn't in the system. That's unusual, but not unheard of. Databases lag. Temporary call signs exist. Military flights sometimes don't populate civilian systems correctly. By the time he showed me what he found, my stomach dropped. The aircraft wasn't missing from the database. It had been removed from it decades ago. The tail number belonged to an aircraft that disappeared over open water more than 50 years ago. No distress call or debris field, no confirmed crash site. It was one of those cases aviation historians argue about. Fuel exhaustion versus mechanical failure versus weather versus something else. The official record listed it just as lost. The call sign had been retired shortly after. No other aircraft had used it since. The hair on my arms stood up when I read that. We pulled the cockpit voice recording from our flight, and the transmission was there, clear as day. We played it back multiple times. The voice hadn't changed, no distortion, no background noise that didn't belong. No indication it was anything other than a normal radio call. ATC confirmed they'd heard it too. When we asked if they'd pulled the aircraft's radar track, the answer came back short and final. There was no radar track, no primary return or secondary transponder. Nothing. Just a voice. Someone suggested it might have been a replay, an old transmission bleeding through, a recording accidentally rebroadcast. That explanation didn't hold. It wasn't a tape. It was interactive. The internal discussion stopped there. Not because anyone ordered it to stop, but because nobody wanted to push it further. There are moments in aviation where you realize you're brushing up against something that doesn't have a checklist. We were quietly advised not to file anything formal beyond noting unidentified transmission. That phrase covers a lot. The recording was archived, and life went on. I told myself it was a coincidence layered on top of another coincidence, that the call sign match was unfortunate, but meaningless, that someone somewhere had reused an old identifier without updating a database. Except that didn't explain the tail number. or the fact that the aircraft described its position in a way that placed it exactly where the missing plane would have been, given its last known heading, adjusted for modern routing. That detail came out later, during an off-the-report conversation with someone who'd looked deeper than they were supposed to. The next time I heard that call sign, it wasn't on one of my flights. It was over coffee, in a crew room halfway across the world. Another pilot mentioned it casually. Said he'd heard a strange transmission once that didn't match anything on his displays. Said the voice sounded old-fashioned, whatever that means. When I asked him what the call sign was, he hesitated. Then he told me. And it was the same one, same number. He hadn't looked it up because he hadn't wanted to. Neither of us said anything else after that. There are ghosts people talk about in aviation, phantom airports, runways that appear in fog, lights that don't belong to anything. Most of those stories get exaggerated with retelling. This one does not need embellishment. Incident 4. The Blue Orbs. Now, by the time this happened, I'd stopped assuming that every strange event would announce itself as strange. Most of the things that stayed with me didn't arrive with alarms or urgency. They showed up quietly, like something that expected to be seen eventually. This was a night flight over open water. Long haul, high altitude. The kind of route where there's nothing to look at outside except stars and the faint reflection of the cockpit on the glass. These flights are monotonous in a way that actually sharpens your awareness for me. There's less visual clutter, fewer radio calls, fewer distractions. You notice small things. The first officer was the one who saw it first. He didn't react right away. He leaned forward slightly, adjusted his seat, and looked again before saying anything. That's a habit most pilots develop early. Confirm with your own eyes before you bring someone else in. After a few seconds, he said, "Did you see that off the left side?" I followed his gaze. At first, I assumed it was a reflection. That's almost always the answer. Internal lighting, instrument glow, a star lined up just wrong. I shifted my head and changed angles. The light didn't move. It was blue, not white blue or strobe blue, a deep, saturated blue, like a welding arc seen from a distance. It sat slightly below our altitude, a few miles off our left wing, steady and constant. Then a second one appeared, then a third. They didn't pop into existence, they faded in smoothly, as if they'd been there the whole time and we'd only just noticed them. They weren't flashing or rotating. They were leaving contrails or reflections. They just sat there matching our speed. And that's when the first officer quietly said, "Those aren't stars." I checked TCAS. Nothing. No traffic or altitude returns or warnings. I checked the weather radar next. Completely clear. Well, we altered speed slightly, not enough to be operationally significant, just enough to see if relative position would change. It didn't. The lights adjusted with us. Not aggressively or suddenly, just enough to maintain spacing. And that was the moment the cabin got real quiet. Neither of us reached for the radio right away, not because we were afraid to, but because we didn't yet know what we'd be reporting. Pilots don't call ATC to say, "There's something weird." You need specifics. Altitude, bearing, distance, behavior. I keyed the mic and asked ATC if they had any traffic near our position. They didn't. I asked again, more specifically, giving relative bearing and altitude. Negative traffic. I asked if any military activity was scheduled in the area. None. We watched the lights for several minutes. They didn't approach or retreat. They didn't cross in front of us or fall behind. They behaved like formation traffic, except there was no aircraft. Eventually, one of them moved. It didn't accelerate away. It didn't climb or descend in a way that matched aircraft performance. It simply slid laterally, arcing around our nose and repositioning itself on the right side of the aircraft. The movement was smooth, and that's when I felt real unease. Because I'd heard about this before. Not in rumors, not online. In official briefings and incident summaries that never quite make the headlines. Commercial pilots in Europe have reported blue lights pacing aircraft at cruise altitude. Navy pilots off the US East Coast have described spherical objects that glow blue or white and maneuver without visible propulsion. FAA safety reports include entries describing unidentified luminous objects maintaining formation for extended periods before vanishing. There was a widely reported case years ago involving pilots over the Pacific who described blue orbs orbiting their aircraft at altitude. Another involved airline crews over the Middle East seeing similar lights during night operations, recorded by multiple cockpit crews independently. Those reports are always written carefully. No speculations, just behavior. And that's exactly what we were seeing. The orbs weren't affected by our wake. They didn't drift when we altered heading slightly. They weren't buffeted by air currents. They behaved like they were in their own environment, intersecting ours temporarily. Well, after about 10 minutes, ATC called us. They hadn't seen anything on radar, but another aircraft behind us had reported unusual blue lights in the same general area. That did something to my sense of scale. This wasn't isolated to us. We weren't being singled out. We were passing through something other crews had encountered too. The lights didn't vanish all at once. One dimmed and faded. Another followed a minute later. The last lingered the longest, holding position off the right wing before sliding backward and disappearing into the dark. No acceleration or flare, just gone. The rest of the flight was quiet. After landing, we wrote it up the only way you can write something like that up. Precise and minimal. Behavioral. No adjectives that didn't belong. 3 blue luminous objects observed at cruise altitude. Maintained relative position. No TCAS return, no radar contact. No turbulence or system anomalies. That's it. Later during the layover, a different crew approached us quietly. They asked if we'd seen anything unusual on the route. They didn't need to explain further. They had. And it was the same color and behavior and quiet departure. Now, nobody suggested aliens. Nobody joked. Nobody speculated. That's not how pilots talk about things that make them very uncomfortable. We talked about what happened, then we moved on. But from that point forward, whenever I flew at night over open water, I found myself scanning the dark a little more carefully. Incident 5. The Red Sky. This was the first time the sky stopped behaving like sky. Not visually strange in a subtle way or ambiguous. Not something you could rationalize if you stared at it long enough. It was very wrong. Now, this was a night flight over continental airspace, well within controlled routing, nothing remote or exotic. Weather briefings were clean across the board. No convective activity, no high cloud tops, no anomalies. The first half of the flight was uneventful enough that neither of us would have remembered it otherwise. The first sign came from the horizon. At first glance, it looked like distant weather illuminated by city glow. That happens sometimes. Storm systems can reflect sodium vapor lights and create strange colors at night. But this wasn't reflected light. The sky ahead of us, it was red, not streaked, not layered or moving. A deep, uniform red filled the entire forward view, from left to right, from below the nose to well above our altitude. It didn't brighten gradually, it was simply there, like a wall we hadn't noticed until we were close enough to see it. I checked the weather radar immediately. Clear. I adjusted the tilt, increased gain, switched modes. Still clear. The first officer leaned forward, eyes fixed on the windshield. He didn't say anything at first. The red didn't get closer the way weather does. It didn't resolve into clouds or bands. Didn't change shape. It waited. And then the turbulence hit. Not chop or gradual build. The autopilot disconnected hard, and the aircraft lurched as if it struck resistance. Wasn't air pressure, it was something denser. The controls responded normally, but the feedback felt very wrong, like flying through a medium that wasn't uniform. And outside, the red intensified. And then things started to move inside it. These were not vague shapes. These were enormous. The first one became visible as a silhouette against the red, then resolved enough that scale became impossible to ignore. It was massive, longer than our entire wingspan, moving slowly across our forward field of view. It wasn't flying the way aircraft fly, it was swimming through the red, its body undulating as if the sky itself had depth. Then another appeared, then another. They were huge. Not large animal huge, continental shelf huge. The kind of size you associate with deep ocean creatures. Things that only make sense where pressure and darkness hide scale. One passed close enough that I could see structure. There was a head. There were wings. More shapes followed, some vertical, rising through the red as if ascending from below. Others horizontal, gliding past at different depths. One moved beneath us, and the aircraft jolted again, like we crossed a wake. The first officer said something then. Disbelief? ATC called us. They asked if we were experiencing turbulence. I answered yes and requested an immediate deviation. They approved it instantly. The turbulence intensified again. The aircraft shuddered as another massive shape passed close enough that I could see it. One of the creatures turned, and I don't want to describe it. I committed to a full reversal. Not a standard deviation or gradual turn. I turned the aircraft back the way we came. As the turn completed, the red began to collapse. It didn't fade, it was like it folded. The sky ahead compressed inward, forming a circular distortion, darker at the edges, lighter in the center. And then we crossed a boundary. The sky snapped back to normal. Black, empty stars. The turbulence stopped instantly. Autopilot re-engaged without complaint. All systems stabilized. No warnings or residual effects. It was like it hadn't happened. ATC called again, asking us to confirm heading and intentions. I told them we were returning to our departure airport due to unforeseen severe turbulence. That was true. The landing was uneventful. Maintenance found nothing wrong with the aircraft, no damage or sensor faults. The flight data showed sharp turbulence events, and it showed nothing else. Of course it didn't. Later, in a quiet room. The first officer asked the only question that mattered. "What do you think would have happened if we kept going?" I didn't answer. Now, this last incident is very hard to explain, not because it was frightening exactly, but because it was ridiculous. There was no red sky or lights, no voices on the radio. It was just weather. At least that's what it was supposed to be. We were on descent when the turbulence started. Not unusual at that altitude. Little rougher than forecast, but nothing that justified concern at first. Then it intensified rapidly. Sharp jolts, sudden drops, impacts against the fuselage loud enough to be heard over the engines. It sounded like hail. That's what I told the cabin crew. Secure the cabin, expect a rough ride, standard procedures. We checked weather radar. Nothing. No cells or returns or precipitation. And then something struck the windshield hard enough that both of us flinched. Another hit followed, then several more. Rapid, uneven impacts, like we were flying through a dense shower of debris. The aircraft shook violently. The turbulence wasn't smooth or patterned. It felt chaotic, as if objects were striking us from multiple directions. We slowed. We descended faster than planned. ATC asked if we needed assistance. I told them we were encountering severe turbulence and possible hail. That was the closest word available. By the time we broke out into clear air, the impact stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. The rest of the descent was smooth. The landing was uneventful, though the aircraft did need inspection before the next leg. That didn't surprise anyone. Hail can do serious damage even when radar misses it. What surprised everyone was what maintenance found. There were small, colorful fragments smeared along the leading edges of the wings, in gaps near control surfaces, embedded in places hailstones shouldn't reach. At first, one of the mechanics thought it was insulation or paint transfer from ground equipment. And then he picked one up, and it was sticky. Another one was intact enough to identify. A jelly bean. Not melted or burned, just cracked and flattened from impact. They found hundreds of them. Different colors. Red, yellow, green, purple. Some stuck to the wing like residue. Others lodged in seams and crevices. A few had bounced hard enough to leave faint dye streaks in the paint. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Eventually, someone asked if a catering cart had exploded mid-air. It hadn't. Someone else suggested cargo contamination. Yeah, there was no cargo like that on board. Weather logs were checked. No reports of hail. No storms anywhere near our route. No explanation for why candy would be falling from the sky. The official report listed unknown foreign object debris associated with severe turbulence. The jelly beans were cleaned off and disposed of. I think I even saw a couple of our guys eating them. No samples were kept, as far as I know. Of all the things I have seen flying, that's the one people laugh about when they hear it. Even other pilots. Especially other pilots, and I don't blame them. But every time I see a maintenance crew inspecting wings after turbulence now, I think about how easy it is for something absurd to slip through the cracks of explanation. There was no monsters or lights or warnings. Just a hell of a lot of candy falling from an empty sky. Well, I still fly. That's usually the first question people ask when they hear some version of these stories. They expect hesitation or a change in tone, or an admission that something broke permanently in my brain after all this. It didn't, as far as I know. I still trust the airplane. I still trust the systems. I trust the people I fly with. Aviation works because it is built on discipline, repetition, and the refusal to panic when something unexpected happens. None of what I've described took that away from me. What it changed was how I think about the sky. Pilots are trained to believe that airspace is consistent, that distance in physics behaves the same everywhere, that time passes at the same rate regardless of where you are, as long as your clocks agree. We treat the sky like a three-dimensional map you can fold neatly into numbers. And most of the time that model works. But not always. Over the years, I've come to accept that there are pockets of airspace that don't behave the way the rest of it does. Places where objects arrive early, where time compresses, where voices come from aircraft that never landed, where lights pace you without showing up on anything that's supposed to see them, where entire sections of sky change character without warning. None of this happens often. That's important to understand. If it did, aviation wouldn't function. Flights wouldn't arrive. Systems would fail constantly, and people wouldn't shrug these things off and keep going. The rarity is what allows it to exist unnoticed. Most pilots go their entire careers without encountering anything like what I've described. Many who do encounter it will dismiss it, forget it, or decide it isn't worth talking about. This job doesn't encourage philosophical detours. We don't get paid to wonder. Still, there are quiet adjustments people make. Routes some crews don't like. Headings they avoid if they don't have to take them. Sections of sky that feel off on certain nights for reasons no one writes down. Now, none of this is official. None of it shows up in manuals. It doesn't need to. Aviation is full of unspoken rules. No, I don't think the sky is hostile. That's the part people get wrong when they hear stories like this. They jump straight to fear or invasion or intent. What I've seen doesn't feel aggressive exactly. Maybe it's indifferent. Like we're passing through systems that weren't designed with us in mind. The red sky didn't chase us. The lights didn't intercept us. The creatures didn't react beyond noticing that we were there. Even the jelly beans, as absurd as that sounds, didn't feel targeted. They just happened. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, because it suggests that whatever else exists up there isn't concerned with us one way or the other. It's like we're incidental. Most days we move through the sky unnoticed. Some days we brush up against something larger. Now, I don't tell passengers about any of this. I don't hint at it. I know a lot of people are afraid of flying. People deserve a calm flight. They deserve confidence. They deserve to believe that the sky behaves the same today as it did yesterday. And most of the time it does. If there's any advice buried in all this, it isn't about fear. It's about humility. The world is bigger than our systems. The sky is older than our maps. Just because we've learned how to move through it efficiently does not mean we understand it.